go ahead and get started for sake of time. So there's a lot of factors that affect negotiation. Many of these issues, such as gender and ethnicity, sexual orientation, socioeconomic status, there's a lot of things that perhaps we don't necessarily have within our control, but in the negotiation field, we are able to control a lot of factors, and so we're going to try to impart some things that we've learned along the way and taught others along the way about how to do this effectively. It turns out that the body of knowledge about negotiation maybe 20, 30 years ago was that perhaps women in particular don't ask. But it turns out that research over the last few years has shown that we actually are asking, and probably asking just as much as our peers. However, we're not getting the same return on our ask. And so if we can find things that we can do within our control, then perhaps we can have some more success. If you don't ask, there's a lot of consequences, right? Reduced lifetime earnings, your own health actually is affected, it's shown in many studies. Delays in career advancement and missed opportunities, and obviously this isn't a good thing for the culture of our institutions. Furthermore, we have actually some pros, and this is kind of a female-focused lecture, but there's a lot of negotiation pearls for the males in the audience, but pros as females in negotiation. So it turns out that we have some tacit knowledge in our relationships with other people of really forming interest-based discussions. We're interested in what the other side thinks and needs, and we're very interested in cooperative type discussions and negotiations, and that can be a huge benefit as we work through these negotiation exercises today and as you do this in your jobs and careers. So Carmen, you got
So everyone received 2 sheets, one yellow, one blue, so those are different roles. So you'll read your introduction and then you'll read the first part of section 1. You'll have 5 minutes to negotiate with your partner, and your goal is to come up with the amount of donation from the developer to the neighborhood association. So you'll have a couple minutes to read, and in 5 minutes we'll debrief from how this went and what number you got to.
track of time.
All right, you've got about 3 more minutes, so if you haven't started negotiation, get on your way. You've got to get to a number.
to just set you up live here. He said just to do it right now. Let's see if we can.
Okay, guys, so you got about another minute, and by the end, let's write down what you've negotiated at the bottom of the paper.
Can we go forward, slide back? That just yes. Okay. Sorry about that.
All right, you guys have about a minute left. Go ahead and write down kind of what your negotiation endpoint was. All right, let's wrap it up. We're going to debrief for a minute.
Okay, I think there's few enough of us here that we can probably just say our numbers out loud. So give us your final number. What'd you guys get to? 45,000. 25,000. Oh, wow. Okay. Love it. This is going to be an amazing playground. I already heard yours. Anybody else? Oh, you guys just got here. We'll give you a pass. Any other numbers? Okay. Fair. All right. So you can see a wide variety. So how did that feel for you guys? The best way to learn about negotiation is to practice it. How did that feel? Right, both want something more hard to make everybody happy. Yes.
The community had no idea how much money I was willing to spend. Yeah. And so
Ooh.
I felt guilty and I spent an extra $5,000, but there was no need for me to do that.
So, but generosity may go a long way. There's a part two to this scenario, right? But you're hitting on that exact point. The community had absolutely no idea how much you were willing to spend.
And I tried to go on the high end and then add in extra for labor and stuff like that. And she came with a number that was bigger than what I had anticipated. And she's like, well, but you would have to put in community donation. I'm like, sure, we'll figure it out,
Right, and so not knowing that landscape led to you receiving probably a lot less than maybe you could have at the end. Yeah. All right, any other responses from the back from your group?
I thought our negotiation was very pleasant. We started with what the win-wins were, and that it would, as a developer, she wants to turn this property over, and the social cohesion and the increased value that we can do. So it was, a win-win from the beginning.
That's great.
Great. So you guys were really focusing on the interests of each other.
Yes, and one more?
The only thing that we realized that they wanted to name it after the estranged grandfather, and I didn't know how that would play into things, because that seemed to be very controversial.
All right. So let's talk a little bit about what we can learn from this. Did anybody feel awkward or nervous in the conversation? Yes. Yeah. I think a lot of us feel that way when we're entering into these conversations. So I'm going to stand up here. All right. So we're going to talk about 5 steps to start with, and then we're going to enter into a little bit of a different scenario, or a little extra to this scenario. But 5 steps to really master going into your negotiation with some confidence. So step 1 is really, and this is not just applying to the exercise that you just did, but let's broaden it out to your day-to-day, right? Is figuring out what you really want, what you're passionate about, what you need, what skills you have, and what skills you may have to glean to get where you need to go. and what you may regret if you don't go ahead and push forward towards this negotiation or goal. And in doing so, what you really need is to have a good community around you to help you get to those goals and actually figuring out what your plan is. And that's sometimes the biggest part, right? I think a lot of us kind of meander a little bit in our careers, and I'm kind of making this more career applicable for us. But if you really have some concrete goals that you set for yourself, whether it be 1, 3, 5 years that you write down and you commit to, you usually have more success. Literature shows that if you actually commit to those, write them down, look at them, and practice towards them, that you'll actually have more success in getting there. Some of these pieces will help you along the way. So mentorship is very important, but there's a big difference between mentorship and sponsorship and coaching. And so mentorship and sponsorship typically come or should come fairly early in your professional development. Mentorship is more of a relationship that you have, that we've all had, with someone who's maybe been around the block before us, right? And can have a personal conversation with us about things that we're going through and provide us with some advice. A sponsor, however, is someone completely different. And a lot of people are missing a sponsor, and this is something that's really important in your trajectory and your professional development. So a sponsor is somebody who holds usually a pretty high leadership role, is pretty connected in your institution or wherever you practice, and can help look for opportunity for you, can help sponsor you and plug you into opportunities and events. And so this piece is really important. You need to identify somebody who can kind of bring you into the club, if you will, or bring you into the mix. And then the third piece is coaching. Professional coaching sometimes comes further into your career because it's sometimes costly. But if you have the opportunity to have a professional coach, they're very helpful, especially when you're going through big transitions and big negotiations in your career, to help you drive forward towards your goal. So step 2 is doing your homework. This is really an important piece. So you want to get data. People feel more confident in negotiations when they know what the landscape is, which was what Dr. Wolf was referring to. And so, for example, because we talk a lot about salary negotiations and protected time, because that's what a lot of us are dealing in, when you're doing this, get the data on your specific, goal roles. So there's AAAMC, Sullivan-Cotter, MGMA, all of these big groups that give you data that tell you, hey, this is what this role looks like in this geographic region. And here's the breakdown. Here's the 10th percentile. Here's the 100th percentile of salary. And it's not perfect data. It doesn't take into consideration every little puzzle piece of what your job is going to look like, but it's going to give you a landscape or a framework to work with so you know what's reasonable in your negotiation. You're not shooting way out of the park. And you feel more confident. If you know that you're negotiating for a median salary, maybe you shouldn't be negotiating for a median salary, right? But you know, hey, that's what the data shows, and you're not walking in blindly. The other piece to this of getting prepared is what we referred to in that first exercise. So you shouldn't think of negotiation as a position versus a position. And this is a pretty popular figure when we talk about negotiation. So you go from the positions up top and you go to the bottom to the actual interests at hand, and you're really talking about the why. So the more you can understand about the person or the ideas or interests of who you're negotiating with, the better off you will do in your negotiation. It's really about not a me versus you, but a getting to, like you guys talked about, a win-win at the end. And then you can find at the bottom where you see where these two triangles intersect the mutual interest that's served. So step 3 is writing out your strategy. The strategy piece is really important, and you need to be very thoughtful about this, and we're going to give you a worksheet at the end of this that will kind of help you navigate this piece. But there's a few things that you need to set before you go into the negotiation. The first is a target value. So the target value is like your pie in the sky. It's what you're really shooting for. And when you go into the negotiation, it's what you're focused on. It's your aspirational goals, right? Your reservation value is kind of the lowest of that value or whatever you're negotiating for that you'll accept before you move on to your plan B. And the key to this part of the lecture is to understand how that plan B is very different from the lowest value that you'll accept. And so the plan B is typically called the BATNA. And BATNA stands for the best alternative to a negotiated agreement. So the idea behind the BATNA is, and I love this figure because I think it explains it well. If you're negotiating for something and you cannot reach whatever that reservation value was, that lowest option, then you should have a game plan. You should have a plan B. You should never enter into a negotiation where you say, oh, we'll just see how it works out, and if it doesn't work out, I'll figure something out, right? You always need to have your other option. And the stronger your BATNA, the stronger your other option, the better you will negotiate. This is proven, okay, on multiple studies. So the idea behind the BATNA is if you go into the negotiation and you know your alternative, you're pretty comfortable with it, right? So if I don't get X, Y, and Z in this negotiation, my lowest reservation value, then I'm going to have this other really great offer with this really great salary and all these wonderful benefits. You're going to go into that negotiation with so much confidence. You got nothing to lose, right? And so you negotiate better. You negotiate a little bit more successfully and aggressively because you have that confidence. So anytime you're going into a discussion of, what is your interest? What is my interest? Where do we need to go? Always go into it with, okay, well, if this doesn't work out at this meeting, then this is my next plan, right? So that's one of the big take-homes. And then the fifth piece to this is really setting yourself up for success. So there's a lot of little pieces that you may not think about going into these discussions that you should keep in mind. One of them is when and where. So you want to make sure that you're meeting at a place, and we're going to talk about this in a little bit, but meeting at a place that feels comfortable to you, that you feel confident in, and the time that you meet is actually important. So you shouldn't typically ask for things on a Monday morning, right? You shouldn't negotiate on a Monday morning. You might want to think about negotiating in a Friday morning, maybe right after a meal. Don't do it right when the boss has their foot out the door for their weekend or wherever they're going, because then they'll be in a hurry and rush through this. But sometime where you're catching the other person with their other interests at a good time for both of you. If you know you're not a morning person, don't negotiate in the morning. Don't, just say, no, that time doesn't work for me, and pick a time that feels good to you. And when you go into the negotiation, get your mind right. So that means don't come out of a traffic jam and go right into your negotiation, right? If that means meditation or yoga or exercise before you go, or rehearsing what you're going to say, whatever it takes, get your mind right before you go into the talk. Make sure you're focusing on your target goal, not your reservation. So don't go in thinking about the lowest you'll accept. Think about the aspirational goal. And then prepare your pace. So if there's an awkward silence, let the awkward silence be. Don't feel like you need to jump in and add something to the conversation, because typically what you jump in with is a concession. So watch the pace of the conversation and let it play out as it is. If you need to put things on the back burner for a couple days and think about it, it's okay to say, I need a couple days to think about this, and we can revisit this in a couple of days. And then the last piece is if you get stuck in the negotiation, and we're getting ready to practice the second piece of this, if you get stuck, it's like the ABCs in trauma, go back to the airway, go back to the interest at hand. Go back to what is important to you and what is important to me, and you usually will get to a good end point. So we're going to go into the second piece of this exercise, keeping these strategies in mind, right? So read through your scenario. We'll give you another 5 minutes to talk it through with your partner, and let's see if we can end up with some good negotiations in the end using these pieces and what we've learned. All right?
About 2 minutes left. Go ahead and wrap up and come up with your final conclusions. All right, last minute. All right, let's hear how people ended up. Apartments, houses, how many? What else is the community getting? Anybody willing to share?
Right back here.
All right.
We are so excited about our shared vision, and we're ready to run the world over here.
I love it.
So we have this lovely shared vision of about 3-story being the highest, multiple condo units for 100 families with lots of green space in between to be very family focused.
Okay.
And we have the shared idea that this new community really needs a community gym and a new pool. And so that's definitely going to be a part of what's coming through the plan.
Okay, great. Anybody else?
Similar, we met in the middle and came up with duplex townhomes that look and feel like single-family homes around a lake, but give more units to the developer.
Wonderful. Anyone else reach any good conclusions? Compromises in the middle? One way or the other? Oh, right. Total failure up here. That's a great one to talk about. Tell us about it.
Yeah, so I came into negotiation thinking that I could be sneaky and get exactly what I wanted. And as it turns out, I can't. And I think that if we are able to get to the table again, then sure, we might be able to come to a conclusion. But the conclusion, whenever we were done with our conversation, came out to be that I would get less single-family homes than I wanted, and I would get 0 of the apartments. So I kind of messed that one up. So.
You probably learned more from that than anything I'll say, huh? Yeah. Yeah, practice makes perfect, and exactly, you went in and you thought you were going to get everything you wanted and ended up getting nothing. So good observation. Anybody else? All right.
Who had the stronger BATNA in the conversation? Did one side have the stronger alternative, do you think? Did you guys think about that going into it? So you could think about it as, hey, does the developer have more to lose here? Or does the seller? And does the developer realize that the seller has the kind of better BATNA, right? Because if you knew that that more land was going to be developed down the road, you may go into it with a little bit of a different, and if you knew that other developers were kind of competing for this, and if you lose, you lose. So that will really affect your conversation too, right? So you better, if you're the developer, you better go in with some good ideas of a shared interest. Okay, hold on, we got a comment back here.
Listening to you make me realize I didn't even use my BATNA. So I think I forget that in general, and I think a lot of people do now that I'm thinking about it. It's like I had a BATNA. I had a conversation yesterday, had a BATNA. I didn't lay it on the table. So I think if you don't lay it on the table, you lose out.
Absolutely, and that's why planning is so important. While I'm talking, Dr. McCoin's going to pass out a worksheet that we've developed to help you plan for your next negotiation. So there's many elements, and every negotiation will be different depending on what you're negotiating for, but we tried to capture kind of the most common kind of key things that you need to consider, and if you write down your BATNA and you have it staring at you in the face, you're more likely to consider it and use it in your negotiations. So Dr. McCoin and I tried to come up with kind of the 7 most common things that people come to us with when they're asking questions about negotiation. So we found kind of the 7 most common topics, and we're going to address those in the time that we have left. I'll share just my favorite quote that is adapted, was initially about diplomacy, but negotiation is the art of letting someone else have your way. And that's what it's all about, is understanding what those interests are of the other person and how you can get to this shared vision and a great agreement for both sides. So who experiences anxiety when they go to the negotiating table? Anybody? Right? It's probably almost all of us. And in a study that in Women Don't Ask, it said 2.5 times more women than men will report anxiety during negotiation. So we all feel that. We all feel like that kind of internal turmoil. The worst thing you can do for someone who's having anxiety is to tell them to just keep calm, right? No amount of slow breathing is really going to help us when you're sitting at the negotiation table. So instead of just trying to be less anxious, what we can do is we can reimagine that anxiety as excitement. Anxiety is a high arousal state. We all feel that. We feel our heart rate. We feel that adrenaline. And so instead of trying to squelch that or eliminate it, we can reinterpret it as excitement for opportunity to come. Been well studied in behavioral studies and everything from exam taking, public speaking, singing, that this is actually incredibly effective because it puts you into an opportunity mindset. That yes, you feel those emotions, but it's excitement about what is to come and the things that could come out of this negotiation that could be positive for both sides. Another thing to do is just to go ahead before you ever get started. We talked about the BATNA. What about the WATNA? The worst alternative to a negotiating. What is the absolute worst thing that could happen if this goes totally wrong? Go ahead and imagine it, experience those emotions before you get to the negotiation table, and you may find out that it's not that bad after all. As emergency doctors, we realize that if it doesn't end in death or permanent disability, it's probably going to be okay. So go ahead and think about that, get through it, and then during the negotiation, those negative emotions won't come to mind. I think a lot of us deal with imposter syndrome. It's a very commonly studied and talked about topic. But remember, who was the greatest imposter ever? One of those people was Superman. So put on your cape, your heels, your power outfit. Call someone who really believes in you and can give you that confidence. Confidence absorbs that anxiety. And so if you can get into that mindset before you go into the room, you'll already be ahead of the game. All right, so let's move on to the second conundrum, is managing the relationship. A lot of times we're negotiating with people that we will continue to work with for many years. And a great study from the Harvard Business Review looked at negotiating and gender and what people's fears were. And a fear that was much more common in women than men was the fear of backlash or fear of loss of relationship. And so it's something that we want to consider as we go into these negotiations. So the first rule is going in and being gracious. You're going to get much more out of slow, measured, polite, and positive speech than you will if you go in like a bull in a china shop pounding your fist on the table. Never cut what you can untie, and proceed graciously. Never say something that you wouldn't be able to take back. Generosity has a place. I love the example that you gave, that you actually gave her an extra $5,000, right? Right, in the first one, because you kind of felt bad for her. But maybe one of the reasons you could do that is to foster goodwill for what's to come in the future, right? In the second scenario, you realize, there may be more development opportunities, more land available. And so it's reasonable to be generous when you can be generous to the other side. I love this quote: if you're going to skin a cat, don't keep it as a house cat, right? If you're going to take someone to the bank, it better not be someone that you hope to negotiate with in the future, right? So you want to be, at the end of the day, you want to be fair and kind to the person that you're negotiating with so that everyone comes out ahead. So this was a very interesting study looking at the perception of success in a negotiation. And it actually doesn't always depend on the number that you get to at the end. A lot of it depends on how people feel about how the negotiation went. And so managing people's emotions and how they take positive and negative information during that negotiation can actually be more important than the outcome itself. So if there are negative things you're going to have to tell the other side, things that they want that you know that you can't give them, you've got to give them bad news. If you know there's a couple of those things coming, you should tell them all of the bad things all at once. Losing is not fun. Not getting what you want is not fun. And it comes with a lot of negative emotions for your counterpart. So if you're gonna have to do that, let them experience all those at one time, rip off the Band-Aid, and tell them all at once. The counterpart is, if you have a couple of concessions that you are willing to make, things that you know will be wins for your counterpart, spread those out. People love to win. Let them revel in that success that they're going to have, and spread those out over time. So you concede something, offer something else, and that will increase their perception of the success of the agreement, regardless of the actual outcome. All right, delay acceptance. This only comes in a couple of instances. So if someone immediately offers you something that's absolutely amazing, instead of agreeing right away, that may cause the other side to feel like they should have asked for more, and perhaps they should. Right, so delaying that, asking a few more questions, and giving it a little bit of time to let the negotiation play out may lead to increased satisfaction on the part of your counterpart. And finally, no cartwheels. There's a very thin line here between gloating and celebrating. And so if you are going to celebrate, make sure you're celebrating a collective victory and not doing that celebrating in front of the person that you've just negotiated with. All right, so now we're going to facing difficult questions. People often ask about, what about ultimatums? How do you handle an ultimatum? What about questions about previous salary? Questions about other things you're considering? These are things that make you nervous that someone's going to ask you. If you're nervous that someone's going to ask you this, go ahead and make an answer for it. Think of all of those difficult questions ahead of time and role play. Have someone practice asking you that question until you get to an answer that you feel like sounds like how you want it to sound. So reframing can be a really excellent technique for this. I put a couple of examples up here that I won't read all of them for you, but the key to this, it's often said that the most dangerous words in a negotiation are yes and no, and it's actually possible to get through an entire negotiation without using either. So reframing, if someone asks you it's either X or Y, propose a Z. If someone, we think that we have to answer directly every question that's asked first, you can reframe that question and redirect if it's something that either you don't feel like you should have to answer, or that maybe would be inappropriate for them to ask, like, tell me your exact last salary. If you feel like there is an elephant in the room and you feel comfortable addressing it, go ahead and bring it up, right? Think about if they were to bring up that really controversial topic, what would you say? And there may be a time where you know your counterpart needs to know something, but they just don't want to bring it up. And if you feel comfortable, go ahead and do it. Get that out of the way early, because if there's still that elephant in the room at the end of the negotiation, someone might not be willing to close because there's still this big unanswered question that no one will address. And finally, referencing objective data. It's really important, as Dr. McCoin said, to have the data before you go in. Know your worth, know what norms are, know what the medians are, and know what the range is. And make sure you're armed with that data. People can kind of argue back and forth and ask you hard questions, but if you actually know the data behind what you're asking for, you're much more likely to get what it is that you want. All right, here's the conundrum of, but what do I actually say? What do I do? What do I actually say when I sit down at this table? So here's a couple of suggestions for what to say. Well, don't say anything, ask questions. As we noted in both of our sessions that we did, that you all did, right? Asking questions and understanding what the other side wanted first is going to get you farther rather than just assuming that you know. Use your interrogative, open questions, what, how, why, to understand more about what someone might be interested in and how you can help them get to that goal and in turn get to your goal as well. Also, use this as a time to help them help you problem solve. How do you think that I could make 20 gadgets an hour if I only have 2 gadget makers here, right? So put the data out there to them and let them help you come up with solutions. And by doing that, they may actually see, wow, that must be difficult to make that many gadgets with only so many gadget makers, right? And so they may see your conundrum that you're facing and be more willing to help you come up with those solutions. All right, don't say anything, listen. As Dr. McCoin said, those periods of silence are incredibly important, and the person that speaks in it is much more likely to say something that they didn't want to say, to concede, or to kind of babble or backtrack. And so if you can leave that space open, that leaves opportunity for you to listen and learn more, and for the other person to make that concession rather than you. The person who's going to win the negotiation is the person who's willing to be quiet for the longest. So if you can pause the longest and sit in that silence and be comfortable with it, you're going to be a step ahead. All right, fifth conundrum is convincing the other side. But how do I actually convince the other side? So this is a whole lecture in and of itself. I'm going to give you the two summary slides, the two summary parts from it. And then certainly we can discuss more afterwards if anyone's interested. The first is a very interesting concept called tactical empathy. It is learning more about the other side in order to give you more power. It's kind of the whole thought that we've talked about this whole time, is that the more you know about the other person, the better you are able to reach an agreement that serves both sides. So how do you gain tactical empathy? How do you employ tactical empathy? A couple of the things we do all the time: active listening. So while the other person is listening, rather than thinking about the next thing that you're going to say, listen. Turn off your brain from your own thoughts where you're forming your own next idea and sentence, and really listen to what that person is saying. A way that you can show that you're actively listening to someone is by mirroring, right? Mirroring their reflection, their attitudes, their emotions back to them. An interesting tactic is to take the last 4 or 5 words of the person's sentence and start your response sentence with that word. If they're saying to you, well, we really would like to do that, but we really just have limited funds this year, you start with, yeah, you guys really have limited funds this year, and that's why it's so important for us to use those funds in the most efficient way for X or Y, for resident wellness, or whatever it is that you're arguing for, right? That way they know that you're hearing what they're saying, you're reflecting that back for them, but then you're turning that in a positive way toward what it is that are your priorities as well. All right, calibrated questions. So these are questions that help you understand more about the motivations and emotions of your counterpart, but also help create a framework for your end goal. So you might ask, how could I increase your confidence in me as a leader in this organization, right? You're setting up the expectation that you are a leader in the organization, and you're gaining more information about what would increase their confidence level in you. What would it take for me to be promoted next year, right? You're setting forth the idea and the framework that you should be promoted next year, but then you're gaining more information about what it is that would qualify you for that position. All right, the 4 horsemen. This was a very interesting article written out of Columbia talking about the 4 horsemen of power. So these are kind of levers that we would pull during a negotiation to convince the other side and get what we want. Here's our 4 horsemen. Alternatives. Having alternatives, a very important, thinking about your BATNA. Information that you have and knowing that you may not have all the information. Status, who you are, what your position is, and your official position is in the organization. And then social capital. Maybe it's not an official title that you have, but the influence that you wield, maybe because you've been there a long time or you've built a reputation as someone that people can understand, listen to, trust, and rely on. A lot of times I'll have people make a quad grid with this, and so going through each of these 4 horsemen, figuring out what horsemen they have harnessed and what horsemen are harnessed by the other side. Doing this ahead of time is really helpful to understand how you can use these to help convince the other side. All right, number 6, getting to a number. This is often what people really want to talk about in negotiations, so I do want to take a chance to slow down and talk about how you get to that actual number. Now, you guys practiced that in the first scenario, and you can see how we ended up with wildly different numbers between the groups. Same information, and we had people all the way from 25,000 to 45,000. So how do you get, if you're going to have to do number negotiation, how do you get what you want? So there's 2 schools of thought. First school of thought is conventional school of thought, is make them say the number. They should definitely say it. You be quiet. You don't open your mouth. Don't utter any number until the other side does. What I'd argue is that there are many times when actually you should be the one saying the number first. And so we're going to take a second and talk about anchoring bias to illustrate this. So the first report for anchoring bias was in the 70s, a very interesting study that they did with some psychologists. So they took a random sampling of people and they said, hey, what % of African countries are in the UN? Now before you answer, spin this roulette wheel. And in half of the people, the roulette wheel was rigged to stop at 10, and half the people was rigged to stop at 65, random numbers. And then they asked them, do you think that this number of countries is higher or lower than that number? Didn't matter what they said. And then they said, tell me what you think the number is. And for the people whose wheel was rigged to stop at 10, the median estimate they gave was 25. And for the people whose median number, or whose roulette wheel stopped at 65, their median number they gave was 45. And that's anchoring bias. Even when you know that the roulette wheel has nothing to do with the number of countries in Africa that are part of the UN, your mind can't help but anchor on that number and to guess around that or closer to that anchor that's been given. Another funny example, asking people the last two numbers of their social security number, right? They tell you the number, and then you show them a bottle of wine, clean label, how much would you bid for this bottle of wine? The lower your number, your social security number is, those last two digits, the lower you'll bid, and the higher you'll bid. Makes no sense. Your social security number has nothing to do with the cost of that wine or how much you value it, but people get anchored around this number. So, what do you do about, so you want to anchor where you want to be. And so that's why saying the number first lets you anchor in a range that is going to be a more acceptable outcome to you. So what do you do if you get anchored? What do you do if the other side throws out the anchor first and you're anchored somewhere you don't want to be? First, the most important thing is to recognize that it happened, right? Like with anything in medicine, recognize that this is happening to you so that you can deal with it. The most common kind of reaction to this is, oh, I should counter from that quickly. But that's actually not what you should do. You have to diffuse the anchor. You have to pull up the chain, pull that up completely, move to a different place in the harbor, and drop the new anchor somewhere else. So, someone throws out a number, you're negotiating salaries, someone gives you a number, and you let them know, Dr. McCoin, unfortunately, I think that we're miles apart on salary here. The median data from the AAMC actually shows that the range should be between 200 and 250,000. So I think that that's probably where we should start the negotiation. Right, so instead of countering from, let's say she offered me $100,000, something ridiculously too low, I've diffused that anchor, I've pulled up the chain, and I have successfully moved us to a completely new level of negotiation. So recognize it, diffuse it right away, don't counter from it, pick up the chain, and move your anchor somewhere else. All right, so how do you know if you're gonna drop that first anchor or if you should wait and see what they give you? It all has to do with the landscape. If you know the landscape and you have data and you have information, then absolutely you should anchor on your aspirational goals. If you have absolutely no idea what something could be worth, when my grandmother died, she left me a stamp collection. I couldn't tell you if it was worth $200 or $2,000. I could tell you I'd paid someone $200 to take it out of my house, but that's probably wasn't what it was worth. And so if you have no idea what something is worth, then you shouldn't be the first one to throw out that number, because chances are it's not going to be in a range that is based on objective data. So that might be an instance where you would want the other person to kind of anchor in a range that gives you more information about what the true worth of that would be. It's interesting when they look at behavioral studies about how people feel about negotiations. In negotiations where people let the other person say the number first, people are more satisfied with the negotiation and they have less anxiety about the negotiation, right? It takes the onus off of them, lets the other person have to do that hard work. But it actually results in a poor outcome. So you actually get a better outcome if you're willing to do the anchoring. So if you're nervous about anchoring, you're nervous about saying that number, practice it ahead of time. I can't stress the importance of role playing enough before you go into a negotiation. All right, so what number do I say? If I'm going to give the number, which number do I say? So these are for very specific circumstances. So give a range when it's appropriate. If you're negotiating salary, there's a lot of other things besides the number that they're going to give you. There's benefits, there's time off, flexibility, etc. And so giving a range helps you appear to be flexible and kind of shows that you know that there's more than just this one number that matters. So when it's appropriate, I think you should give a range, making sure that you anchor it in the aspirational area that you've identified. But if you know exactly what you want, let's say you're selling a necklace on eBay, right? If you put it on for $500, people are going to be more comfortable bargaining with you in larger groups. So if you offer a more precise number, people tend to negotiate in smaller increments. So if you put it on for $500, someone could come back and say, I'll give you $200 or $300. Whereas if you put it on for $485, people are actually much more likely to come back at you with $450, $460 to come closer to that number. It's just one of our kind of natural tendencies in our brain that if it's a more precise number, that you'll negotiate in smaller amounts. Oh, and the last thing here is never apologize for what you're asking for. Never start a sentence with, I'm really sorry, but I'm going to have to ask for a little bit more than that. You're not sorry. You're justified. You don't want people to feel like they're pitting you. You want people to feel like they're agreeing to a fair and just offer. Last thing is pressure tactics. I think we all fear going into these negotiations feeling pressured, like we're going to have to make a decision. So think about that ahead of time and what you're going to do. First, what you're going to do is you're going to have ways to slow down the pace. Most deadlines are arbitrary. Most deadlines were made up by a person. Most things don't actually expire on a certain date. And so there usually is more time if you need more time. And recognizing that is half the battle. You may have mantras that you say in your mind to help you slow down if you're getting into a part of the negotiation or discussion that seems to be going too fast. Stop, right? Take a silent moment and say your mantra to yourself and then move on. As Dr. McCoin said, sometimes it is nice to be able to stop and come back another day, and so go ahead and predefine what those stops will be. This has been a wonderful discussion with you. I'm very excited about coming to a conclusion. I'd like to take a minute and, I'd like to take a few days and talk to my mentor, my partner, my faculty, my students, my residents, whoever it is that you might need to include in this decision, and have that decided ahead of time so that you can stop, put things on pause, and move away. And finally, don't feel like closing the deal is the mark of success. Sometimes walking away is the smartest thing that you can do. Because if someone has offered you something that is worse than your BATNA, then closing the deal will be a mistake. Walk away and take your BATNA if that's the better option. I think that we all there's this language that we have wrong, closing the deal, sealing the deal, and that makes us feel successful. But sometimes the most successful thing to do is to take an objective view of things and to choose not to make any deal and to go back to your plan B that you devised. All right, so that was fast and furious. 7 of the most common things that people ask us when we're talking about negotiation. We've got a couple of minutes here for final questions. If there's any questions from the group, we have one right back here.
Thank you. This was an excellent presentation, much appreciated. My question relates to active listening and gender. I am finding that if I'm in a situation, particularly when I'm negotiating with a male, that the active listening and mirroring is mistaken for agreement. And, is that a gendered issue? And if so, do you have any strategies for that?
Well, that's a great question. I think what you're saying is that when you're doing that active listening and they see you doing this, that you're agreeing, right? So I think that we can listen without nodding, and I think that that's one of the things to keep in mind is that our body language can say a lot, right? We can show that we're listening, but we can show disapproval without kind of nodding as we go. And if you take what they're saying, reflect it back to them, but make sure you say we don't have enough funds for that, right? Right, your funds are running low this year, and that's why this project is actually so important because it maximizes the use of the limited funds that you have, right? So you turn that back to them, you show that you're listening, but you change that to kind of reflect what it is that you actually want. Dr. McCoin?
Yeah, and some of it's the cadence of your conversation. So if you mirror, but you're a slow mirror, they're going to jump in. Right? So you got a slow mirror with the and. So every time Dr. Wolf says something, she says blah, 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 and blah, 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 right? So you don't want to say but, because then you're disagreeing, right? And you're working towards a common mission. But the idea with the mirroring is not to mirror an entire paragraph, but mirror just a few words and then get to your point. And I do think that there is a lot to be said with body language. I agree, you got to look at where you sit in the room. There's even studies on where you sit in a room for a negotiation. If you can sit at either the head of the table or there's a specific spot counter to the head of the table where you can even look this stuff up, right? So there's a lot about body language, how you present yourself, and how you're interacting in that moment where, just like Dr. Wolf said, you don't want to look like a puppy dog, right? Like the yes with the nods. You can go in and be gracious and polite, like she cited, but you don't have to be jumping into the same pool, right?
That's a great point.
Anybody else?
All right, well, we're to the end of our time. We'd be happy to answer questions afterward or by email. Thank you for coming.
Thanks, everybody.